looking at the text, the Psalms mention the word temple more than any other book in the Old Testament, except for 2 Chronicles. Okay, so if you're looking for descriptions of the temple, if you're looking for imagery about the temple, if you're looking for examples of temple worship, the Psalms is a great place to go. It's not so much descriptions of the building of the temple, of the use of the temple, but it's much more organic. It's what was going on in the temple in many cases. The Psalms have been called the hymn book of the ancient temple. So, when we're reading the Psalms, we see this imagery, we can get a feel for what it would have been like to be there. Of course, there's 150 Psalms, and there's a lot of different topics covered, but a lot of temple imagery in those Psalms. So in the research that I've done, I've tried to pick up on quotations of the Psalms, allusions to the Psalms, phrases from the Psalms that appear in the Book of Mormon. And I've been able to find approximately, this research is still being refined, but I've found approximately 50 uses of the Psalms in the Book of Mormon. Okay, and most of these, in fact, I would say all of these are not, they're not given a direct reference. Nephi, Jacob, they're not saying, now I'm going to quote from the Psalms. Okay, they just use it as part of their language. The phrases just appear in the text, and we have to be able to pick those out that, this is coming from the Psalms, or this Book of Mormon author is alluding to the Psalms in this text. But as we look at these phrases from the Psalms in the text, we see that a lot of them allude to the temple context of their original setting in the temple. Okay, so this presentation is not going to be comprehensive. As I said, there's probably about 50 examples of the Psalms appearing in the Book of Mormon. I'm going to look at just a very few of these and concentrate on some very specific imagery regarding the temple. But I want to start with, a place that probably a lot of us would go to find something from the Psalms in the Book of Mormon, which is 2 Nephi chapter 4, which has been named Nephi's Psalm. Okay? So if Nephi's writing a psalm, then we would expect that it's at least somewhat similar to the biblical Psalms, that he may be using phrases from the Psalms in what he's writing. Okay, and we do find that, in fact, this is the case. So when we look at 2 Nephi chapter 4, we find that there's many parallels with Psalms 25 to 31 specifically. There's also references to many other Psalms, or phrases that come out of many other Psalms. Psalm 89, a number of different Psalms. But we can kind of concentrate on 25 to 31. I have a chart here. I'm sure you can't read that. But that is in one of our Know Whys that we've released on Book of Mormon Central, the Know Why about Nephi's Psalm. Is Nephi's Psalm really a psalm? So you can check out bookofmormoncentral.org or knowwhy.org, and this comparison is in there. But we see, 2 Nephi 4, 17 and 19, very similar to Psalm 31, 19, and the list goes on in comparing these. Peter Craigie, who's a well-recognized biblical scholar, psalm scholar, fortunately he's passed away now, he wrote a very well-used commentary on Psalms 1 to 50. Peter Craigie said that Psalms 25 to 31 should be read, generally speaking, in the context of a covenant-making ceremony. Okay, so when we look at Psalms 25 to 31, we're seeing this covenant interaction. There's also a lot of temple imagery in there as well, as it would probably be expected. So just one example, this is from Psalm 27:4. This is beautiful. I love this. I shared this with our youth group at church not too long ago, and a lot of them really like this. Psalm 27:4. One thing I asked of the Lord, that will I seek after, to live in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to behold the beauty of the Lord, and to inquire in his temple. Okay. So if Nephi had access to these psalms, which it seems very likely he did, he's pulling inspiration, he's pulling phrases from these psalms. He's seeing the temple. And most likely what he's writing about, he's meaning to allude back to the temple that we see in these psalms. Okay, so that was 2 Nephi 4. I just wanted to look at that briefly. But let's speak a little more broadly here. What do the psalms tell us about the temple? We see a lot of different imagery in the Psalms regarding the temple, but focusing on a few specific things. When we're reading the Psalms, a lot of them, or a good number of them, were probably used in the pilgrimage feasts. You know, we have the Feast of Passover, the Feast of Tabernacles, or Sukkot. And in fact, this image here is depicting an Israelite family building their sukkah, or their tabernacle, for the Feast of Tabernacles. So we get imagery we get language, perhaps the hymns that were sung as these people traveled to the temple. We know that they're supposed to go up to the temple 3 times a year, at least. This is what is directed in the scriptures. These festival pilgrimages, where the scriptures say that they're to go up and appear before the Lord. Yeah, I'm going to go into this in some depth here, but that phrase, to appear before the Lord, most likely we should probably be reading that as, Israel is supposed to go up to see the Lord. And I'll explain why we should read it that way. So one of these passages, there's Exodus, different passages that talk about these pilgrimages to the temple. Deuteronomy 31:11 states, "When all Israel is come to appear before the Lord thy God in the place which he shall choose, thou shalt read this law before all Israel in their hearing." Okay, so that's the King James Version. And you know what it states? All Israel is to come to appear before the Lord. Okay, the verb there, to appear, is ra'ah, the verb meaning to see. Okay, but it's here we read it it's stated passively, the nifal form. So to be seen. So we come to the temple to be seen by the Lord. However, if you look at any good lexicon, Hebrew lexicon, it will generally state that this phrase should probably not be, or the verb should probably not be passive, but should be active. So the call Hebrew form of the verb. So what we should probably be reading is when all Israel comes to see the Lord, to see the face of the Lord, more specifically. The word that's translated as before in English actually means the face of. So you can translate it as to come to be in the presence of, but a more literal translation would be to come to see the face of the Lord. So this is the purpose of them coming to the temple. There's pilgrimages. They're coming to worship, but their goal is to see the face of the Lord. And so an example of this, with this festival setting, is Psalm 42, and I'm looking at verses 2 and 4. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. When shall I come and appear before God? Or we could translate that, when shall I come to see the face of God? These things I remember as I pour out my soul, how I would go with the throng and lead them in procession to the house of God, with glad shouts and songs of praise, a multitude keeping festival. Okay? So we can imagine this individual being with this throng, with this procession, going up to the temple, and just desiring to be there and to see the face of God as part of this festival. Okay, now, we don't know exactly how this played out. There's a lot of talk about the high priest going into the temple and then coming out of the temple, and people are waiting to see the high priest, and somehow the high priest is representing Yahweh as he comes out of the temple. But we don't know exactly how that worked. But we know from the text that this was their desire, to go to the temple to see the face of God. Okay. Another pilgrimage festival psalm. This one doesn't focus so much on seeing the face of God, but it kind of gives us a picture of what's going on here. This is Psalm 122. He says, I was glad when they said to me, let us go to the house of the Lord. Our feet are standing within your gates, O Jerusalem. So you can imagine yourself being there with this group. Jerusalem, built as a city that is bound firmly together. To it, the tribes go up, the tribes of the Lord, as was decreed for Israel, to give thanks to the name of the Lord. For there the thrones for judgment were set up, the thrones of the house of David. Another great one is Psalm 95. Okay, this is, for a long time, this has been identified as a festival psalm. It says, come, let us sing joyfully to the Lord. Let us shout for joy to the rock of our salvation. Let us come into his presence. Again, literally, that's let us come before his face with thanksgiving. Let us shout with songs of praise to him. Come, let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel in the presence, or again, before the face of the Lord, who made us. For he is our God, and we are the people of his pasture, and the flock in his care. Now, the reason why I wanted to focus on Psalm 95, there's other psalms that we could look at that fit very well in this, this pilgrimage, this festival setting. But Psalm 95 is especially important because we find Psalm 95 in the Book of Mormon, actually multiple times. But before I discuss that, just a note from Hermann Gunkel. Hermann Gunkel is recognized as a pioneer in psalm study in the 20th century. And a lot of our ideas regarding the settings of the psalms, how they were used, how they might have been a part of temple worship, we get the initial ideas coming from Hermann Gunkel, and then others of his students and people of that time. Hermann Gunkel said that Psalm 95 was a temple hymn sung when worshipers journeyed to Jerusalem and sought entry into the sanctuary. Okay, so very much in the location of the temple. Now we find Psalm 95 being used by Jacob, the brother of Nephi. And Jacob, as we know, was anointed by Nephi to be a priest and a teacher over the people of the land. And there's a number of times where we get the idea that Jacob is speaking from the temple. Okay, so Jacob's speech in Jacob 2-3 is at the Nephite temple. It says that explicitly in Jacob 2. Jacob there cites Psalm 95. Psalm 95, 8 and 11, actually in Jacob 1, And then he cites it again in chapter 6, verse 6. So he's almost kind of bookending his writings on the small plates of Nephi with Psalm 95. Okay, Jacob chapter 7 is kind of separate. It talks about Sherem and that. But his writings, he starts and ends with Psalm 95. We also find Psalm 95 cited in Alma chapter 12 and 13. And it's interesting that we find them in those chapters because those chapters are specifically talking about temple, they're talking about the priesthood. That's the section in the Book of Mormon where we get talk about the Melchizedek priesthood. And so it is very fitting that we would find this temple psalm showing up there as well. Okay, so I want to focus now on the idea of the procession up to the temple that we find in the Psalms. There are a number of Psalms that deal with this, some kind of procession, very likely with the Ark of the Covenant being taken in procession, perhaps led by the king, up to the temple. And so just focusing on a couple of verses that talk about this, or a couple of Psalms that talk about this. Psalm 68, your solemn processions are seen, O God, the processions of my God, my King, into the sanctuary. The singers in front, the musicians last, between them girls playing tambourines. Bless God in the great congregation, the Lord, O you who are of Israel's fountain. Okay, so we have this picture, this image of this procession with music and dancers and the Ark of the Covenant going up into the temple. Psalm 118 is another psalm that is perhaps featuring this procession. And I'm just picking out a few verses that are most pertinent here. Okay, so we get this line, open for me the righteous gates, so I may enter through them to give thanks to the Lord. This is the Lord's gate. The righteous will enter through it. Okay, so this idea of the gates of the temple complex opening up for the procession to go through. We get the famous line, the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. And that's been taken as a messianic reference. Psalm 118 is cited throughout the New Testament. But we get the idea here, if this is a messianic reference, the author is comparing the Messiah to the cornerstone of the temple. This is the day that the Lord has made. Let's rejoice and be glad in it. Blessed is the one, or blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Okay, again, this is taken messianically in the New Testament. Let us bless you from the Lord's house. The Lord is God. He will be our light. Bind the festival sacrifice with ropes to the horn of the altar. Okay, so very much this imagery of worship, of the procession going up into, encircling the altar of the temple. There's kind of a nice image of this taking place, this procession going up into the temple grounds. Okay, so just a few notes. Psalm 118 appears in the Book of Mormon. And again, this is being used by Jacob. So Jacob very much, fulfilling his role as priest and bringing in these temple psalms into what he's saying. Psalm 118 is also believed by many scholars to be related to the ancient pilgrimage festivals at the Jerusalem temple. The psalm depicts the righteous passing through the temple gates in procession and circling around the altar of the temple. Jacob, he's using this, and evidently he understands Psalm 118 messianically as well, and he uses it in his speech, in this temple setting. So let me just show you a little bit here. This is, I get excited by this stuff. the way that Jacob uses this is pretty incredible. He uses Psalm 118, verse 22, and he mixes in verses from Isaiah chapter 8 and Isaiah 28 in a way that's talking about the Messiah, but also using this temple imagery. Okay? So this is in Jacob chapter 4, verses 15 to 17. This is kind of his lead-in to the allegory of the olive tree. You know, the reason why he's explaining, or why he uses that allegory. He says, "And now I, Jacob, am led on by the Spirit unto prophesying, that by the stumbling of the Jews," yeah, that's a reference to Isaiah 8, verse 14, "they will reject the stone upon which they might build." Okay, that's from Psalm 118. "And have safe foundation." That's from Isaiah 28. Okay, so he's pulling from these three different sources to create this story about how the Jews are going to stumble because they reject Christ, who should be their cornerstone, their safe foundation. Go ahead.
Are those little footnotes also found in our footnotes in our Book of Mormon? Does it make allusions to Psalms in that way?
I think it does pick up on that, generally. I'd have to go back and look. Maybe somebody could look that up as I'm talking about it. I'm not sure on that now. But Jacob goes on, he says, "But behold, according to the Scriptures, the stone shall become the great and the last and the only sure foundation," again, referring to Isaiah 28, "upon which the Jews can build," Psalm 118. "And now behold, how is it possible that these, after having rejected the sure foundation, can ever build upon it, that it may become the head of their corner?" Okay. So again, mixing those three chapters together. Really nice imagery. We'll see this in the New Testament as well. These, in a number of spots, and Paul does it a number of times, and also 1 Peter, where they're using sometimes two of these, or sometimes all three of them together, but in slightly different ways than Jacob does it. So there must have been some tradition of combining these scriptures, and they understood that they were all kind of referring to the Messiah, and they were all, it's all temple imagery as well. So Jacob's saying, now that we know that they're going to reject this stone, this sure foundation, how are they going to ever have it again? How are they ever going to make Christ their sure foundation after they reject him? And that's when Jacob 5 comes in. And he explains this whole history, with the olive trees, that, as the branches are going to be spread out, they're going to be brought back in. The Jews are eventually going to recognize Christ, right? But he does that, and he introduces that by making these references to the Psalms and to temple imagery. So, some pretty cool stuff. Now, go ahead.
All three of those are in the footnotes.
Oh, they are? Okay, good. All right. So now the context of Psalm 118 and both passages of Isaiah have these two main things in common. They have the temple setting, featuring the building of the temple with the foundation, the cornerstone. All three of them are talking about this. They also can be understood to be referring to the Messiah. Who is that stone? Who is that foundation? Now, when Jacob uses this, it's really quite interesting because he says that he's talking about the Son of God. And then launches into saying that the Son of God is this stone, is this cornerstone. And probably what we're seeing here is Jacob making a really neat play on words in the Hebrew, between the Hebrew word for son, ben, and the word for stone, eben. Okay, so, he's saying The ben is the eben, the son is the stone. Jacob identified Christ, the Son of God, with the imagery of the cornerstone of the foundation of the temple. Okay, so we see Jacob understands this really well. He's able to take these scriptures and use them in a way that an Israelite who was familiar with the temple would have recognized. Okay, so this quote, I've taken this out of a Know Why that's going to be published on Book of Mormon Central in not too distant future. Quotations from the Psalms should be expected from Jacob as he officiated in and discoursed from the Nephite temple as a consecrated priest and teacher over the land. Okay? So when we're reading Jacob, we should expect to see him quoting from the Psalms as a good Israelite priest would likely do. All right. So now I'm just going to touch on this very briefly. There have been great books written on this. Brother Baker has written on these topics. Jack Welch, possibly Matt Roper as well. The temple pilgrimage, the festivals of the Israelites show up a number of times in the Book of Mormon. Or, we see many parallels. And people have pointed out that, these show up in Jacob's temple address, 2 Nephi 6 to 10, also throughout the book of Jacob, as I pointed out here, and also King Benjamin's speech. There have been a number of articles, books focusing on the idea that King Benjamin's speech lines up with the Feast of Tabernacles, or the Israelite New Year festival. And we see a number of parallels throughout his speech. So I won't go into that because those have been explored a lot, and I want to focus more on the text. But I did want to just throw this in here as I'm, continually plugging Book of Mormon Central here. I wanted to show one of our videos that Matthew puts these videos together with the help of many others. This is a video that was recently put out on Jacob, and if he is referring to ancient Israelite autumn festivals, or if that's what he's doing when he's getting up and speaking. So I'll just put that up. I apologize if you've already seen this.
After his ordination to the priesthood, Jacob gave an extraordinary speech about covenants, sacrifice, and the name of God. One interesting thing about this speech is how it themes parallel features of the ancient Israelite autumn festivals, especially that of the Feast of Tabernacles, or Sukkot, which celebrated the blessing and necessity of the atonement. This speech shows subtle connections between the Book of Mormon and the culture of ancient Israel, reinforcing the book's antiquity and consistency with the biblical record. This connection is just another example of how the Book of Mormon rewards careful reading. And now you know why.
So, this type of research, these types of ideas are going to be showing up on Book of Mormon Central. And there have been a few... whoops. I just probably knew that was going to happen. Okay. Hopefully it'll stay off. Look for these ideas, what I'm presenting here, to show up in no wise on Book of Mormon Central. I actually didn't write that one on the Autumn Festivals. That was Stephen and Neil write a lot of these. So, but some of these ideas that I'm presenting here will also show up. I want to focus now on Psalm 24. Psalm 24 is a very interesting psalm. It's been categorized by numerous scholars as a temple entry psalm. A psalm where we can see most likely a description or a depiction of this procession trying to get through the gates of the temple. And a lot of this will be very familiar to you already. But I'll just focus on a few different lines from the psalm. Who shall ascend the hill of the Lord? And who shall stand in his holy place? Brother Baker has a book with essentially that title. He who has clean hands and a pure heart, who does not lift up his soul to what is false and does not swear deceitfully. He will receive blessing from the Lord and vindication from the God of his salvation. Such is the generation of those who seek him, who seek the face of the God of Jacob. So we get that idea again, that this procession, these pilgrims, they're trying to get to the temple to see the face of God. Okay? And this is important. This will come up again. Now that line actually doesn't appear in the King James Version. I mean, it says, who seek the face of Jacob, actually. And misses the fact that this is the face of God. We know that should be, or we have a good idea that should be in there because the Septuagint includes that. Syriac versions of this text include it, and other variations. So we believe that the original of this text would have mentioned seeing the face of God as part of this temple experience. Okay, a couple of other psalms, I could cite more, but there's some other psalms that actually confirm this idea, and it's spread throughout the book of Psalms. So Psalm 17:15 says, "As for me, I shall behold your face in righteousness. When I awake, I shall be satisfied, beholding your form." Okay, so quite clearly the idea that God is going to be seen. Psalm 11:7, "For the Lord is righteous, he loves righteous deeds. The upright shall behold his face." Now, it's really neat that we do find Psalm 24 in the Book of Mormon, or references, allusions to that psalm. So this is in 2 Nephi 25:16. Nephi's talking about the scattering of the Jews and when they're going to be brought back in, how they're going to be brought back in. He says, "And when that day shall come, that they shall believe in Christ and worship the Father in his name with pure hearts and clean hands," okay, that phrase from Psalm 24, "and look not forward any more for another Messiah," he says, then they'll be gathered back in. Then they'll receive their promised blessings. Okay, so the idea, of him referring to Psalm 24, and we can actually tell this is supposed to be a quote of the psalm, because he changes the order. Instead of saying clean hands and pure hearts, he says it backwards. And in ancient times, we call this Zeidel's law. In ancient times, a lot of times they would quote something from the scriptures backwards to let the listeners know that they are meaning to quote from something. Okay, so the idea here in Nephi is that once the Jews are ready, once they're worthy, clean hands and a pure heart, once they're ready for temple worship, essentially, then they won't look forward anymore to another Messiah. Then they'll be able to recognize, they'll be able to see the face, essentially, of the true Messiah, and they'll believe in Christ. We also see Psalm 24 showing up in Alma chapter 5. Okay, that great discourse in Alma 5. Verses 18 and 19, it says, this is where Alma's getting the people to imagine what it's going to be like on the day of judgment. Can you look up into heaven? He says, or otherwise, can you imagine yourselves brought before the tribunal of God, Okay, so essentially, you're imagining yourself having ascended into heaven and standing before the tribunal of God with your souls filled with guilt and remorse. Can you look up to God at that day with a pure heart and clean hands? Again, Psalm 24. Can you look up having the image of God engraven upon your countenances? Okay, so countenance, of course, that's the face again. So having the image of God engraven upon your countenance. And I know Mark Wright has done some great work on that idea and what that might have meant in the the cultural context of the Book of Mormon. But I want to look at it a little bit differently. We know well the story of Moses. I think this is supposed to be a picture of Moses after he's gone up into Mount Sinai and he's seen the face of God, and that's reflected in his own face. He comes down to his people and his face is shining so much that they can't look at him. He has to put a veil over his face. Okay, so there's this idea of transfiguration, of the person who sees God becoming like God and having that same shine, that same glow and light in their face that God has. And so that's kind of what I imagine when Alma says, having the image of God engraven upon your countenances. Your face looks like God's face, okay, because of its brightness. So that brings me to 3 Nephi 19:25. This is one of my favorite stories in the Book of Mormon, where the apostles have been teaching the people. They've baptized a large number of people. These people have the Holy Ghost come upon them. And then, after this has happened, Christ comes to them. And it says, "And it came to pass that Jesus blessed them as they did pray unto him." Okay, so they've been praying to him. "And his countenance," his face, "did smile upon them, and the light of his countenance did shine upon them. And behold, they were as white as the countenance and also the garments of Jesus." So they've undergone some kind of transfiguration here as well. "And behold, the whiteness thereof did exceed all the whiteness, yea, even there could be nothing upon earth so white as the whiteness thereof." Okay, so Jesus, he smiles upon them, his face is shining, he's like gloriously white, and the people are transfigured so that they now look like Jesus in that extent. "And when Jesus had spoken these words, he came again unto his disciples, and behold, they did pray steadfastly without ceasing unto him, and he did smile upon them again, and behold, they were white, even as Jesus." Yep.
I'll ask a question here. We want to wait till the end.
Oh, you're fine.
In the previous slide, as well as in this one, the word white is used several times.
That's right.
And I know that some of the scholars have said that the word white probably should be translated pure. And as I was reading that last slide, to me it made more sense to say pure. And the same here. They were pure, even as Jesus.
Okay.
Do you have any?
Well, no, I think that makes perfect sense, and there is, there were some modifications in the early editions of the Book of Mormon between white and pure, and we actually have a know why about that on Book of Mormon Central, where it goes into that. But you can make that parallel. I think the white it's talking about here is a white of pureness. It's the light that comes forth from Jesus, and so that's, I would agree that that's how we should be looking at it. Okay, so this whole idea of Jesus' face shining, the people see Jesus and his face smiles upon them, his face shines. This is very much in line with a lot of what we see in the Old Testament, and particularly in the Psalms. But I want to start with the priestly blessing. We can find this in Numbers 6:24-26, and it's kind of scattered in various places, including the Psalms, which we'll see. But this is the blessing that the priest was supposed to pronounce upon the people. At some point in the temple worship, he says, "The Lord bless thee and keep thee. The Lord make his face shine upon thee, and be gracious unto thee. The Lord lift up his countenance upon thee, and give thee peace. Okay, so this is the blessing. This is what they were asking for the Lord's face to shine upon them, and they would be blessed because of this. And that's exactly what we're seeing in 3 Nephi 19. Jesus' face shining upon the people and him blessing them. So in the Psalms, we see this. Psalm 4:6. There be many that say, who will show us any good? Lord, lift thou up the light of thy countenance upon us. Psalm 67:1. God be merciful unto us, and bless us, and cause his face to shine upon us. And this is just a couple of examples, but it's found throughout the Psalms and elsewhere in the Old Testament. This desire to have God's face shining upon you. Another cool reference, this in a more festival, temple-type setting. Blessed are the people who know the festal shout. Okay, so they've been taught to say something, to shout something. Who walk, O Lord, in the light of your face. Okay, the people participating in the temple worship, somehow they're waiting for the Lord to shine his face on them. If we go into some of the intertestamental literature, Ben Sira has a story of Simon the high priest. Okay, and there's a description of Simon and him doing his priestly duties, and he does the sacrifice, and he goes into the temple, and he comes out of the temple, and the description says, when he emerged from the Holy of Holies, he was like the morning star, like the sun shining on the temple. His very presence made the court of the temple glorious. So we're getting the same type of idea, but we're talking about the high priest. He's acting out this idea of coming and shining upon the people. In a more narrative form, we get in the book of 2nd Enoch. The idea that Enoch is taken up into heaven to God's presence. He's clothed in angelic garments, and his body becomes like a flame of fire. Okay, so Enoch is become like the angels, or like God even. And he says, I've become like one of the glorious ones. There was no observable difference. Okay, so here we see it playing out in actual ascent to heaven. Enoch sees God, he's there in his presence, and he becomes like the glorious beings in heaven. Okay, so this is drawing us to a close here, but I wanted to show you how well the Book of Mormon uses this temple imagery that we find in the Psalms, and there's so much more that can be said about this. So just kind of a summary of what we've talked about, that there's temple imagery in the Psalms. Okay, we looked at various Psalms, including Psalms 95, 118, and 24. And we find these particular Psalms, again, there are many others, but I wanted to focus on these. We find these Psalms in the Book of Mormon. We looked at 2 Nephi 4, or Nephi's Psalm, which quotes or alludes to Psalms about the temple and about making covenants. Jacob, we saw, uses Psalm 95 in a temple or festival context. Jacob also uses Psalm 118 and also Isaiah to depict this, or using temple imagery to talk about the Messiah. Nephi uses Psalm 24 to talk about the Jews preparing to see, to recognize the Messiah. Alma also uses the same psalm in kind of a different way, getting the people to imagine themselves going up into heaven and being before the Lord, seeing the Lord and having his image reflected in their faces. Then we looked at 3 Nephi 19 and the shining face of Jesus, and then the people becoming like Jesus. And we saw how this fits very well into this temple tradition. that we see throughout the Psalms. So in conclusion, the Book of Mormon authors very likely had access to at least some of the Psalms, either on the plates of brass or perhaps by memory as well. We don't get a whole lot of reference to these Psalms in the Book of Mormon, but they are in there. Somehow they're in there. And so perhaps we can conclude that they were, at least some of them, somewhere on the plates of brass. The Israelites, especially the priests and the Levites, knew the Psalms and sang them regularly the way that we know hymns from our modern hymn books. Okay? There's many instances where we throw in lines from Psalms that we know so well. Come, come, ye saints. We know where that's from. Okay, so we see this happening in the Book of Mormon. They're throwing in these Psalms into what they're saying. Jacob, for example, worked as a priest in the Nephite temple and would therefore be expected to know the priestly traditions of the ancient Israelites. Right.
He was born in the wilderness.
He was.
So where would he get it from if not the brass plate?
Right. Well, if he's getting these from Lehi and Nephi, if, they knew them, being Israelites, most likely participating somehow in the temple ordinances. But yes, we probably expect, because Alma's citing them as well, so we would probably expect that they're somewhere on the plates of brass. Yeah. The fact that they quote from the Psalms provides greater depth to their words and illumines the temple setting and background of much of the text of the Book of Mormon. Thank you very much.